The mountain learned his name before any woman ever did. Snow carried it along the ridges and pressed it into the timbered hollows where Silas Crow had built his life from boards, calluses, and habit. That winter arrived early and stayed like it had a grievance, sealing the sky low and pale, the kind of cold that made a man aware of his own breathing. Silas moved through it with the patience of someone who had long ago stopped asking the weather for mercy. Each morning, he split wood before the sun could decide whether to rise, his axe biting clean, his thoughts quieter than the white fields around him. This was how he prepared for marriage, not with hope, but with readiness. The cabin sat high enough that the town below looked small and temporary, a scatter of roofs that gossip could not quite climb to without effort. Inside, Silas set a second plate on the rough table, then stared at it longer than necessary, as if it might speak first. He had built the extra chair weeks ago, planed it smooth, tested its weight, then set it against the wall like an apology. This marriage had been arranged the way men arranged fences or debts, by necessity, not desire. He did not resent it. Resentment required energy, and he had learned to ration that. People in town said he was lucky. A man his age, alone that long, getting a woman willing to come up the mountain in winter. They said it like a kindness, but it carried the faint edge of judgment, as if solitude were a flaw finally corrected. Silas listened when they spoke and nodded when required. He did not tell them that solitude had been his most faithful companion, or that it was easier to live with silence than with expectations you might fail. He knew little about Eliza May Hollister, only what was necessary and what had already been twisted by rumor. She was a schoolteacher once. She was said to be quiet. There had been talk, always talk, enough to push her west, far enough that the mountain felt like a sentence passed by people who would never see her again. Silas did not ask for details. Whatever shame she carried would find its own way into the room, without invitation. The day she arrived, the sky was iron-colored, snow sifting down in deliberate, soundless sheets. Silas stood at the window longer than he meant to, watching the narrow road disappear and reappear beneath the drifts. When he finally saw movement, it was not dramatic, just a figure resolving itself from white into human shape, step by careful step. She stopped at the door and brushed snow from her coat before knocking, as if manners still mattered this far from town. Eliza did not look at him right away when he opened the door. Her eyes moved first to the warmth behind him, the fire breathing low and steady. She smelled of cold air and wool, and something faintly medicinal, like the schoolrooms he remembered from boyhood. "Thank you for the fire," she said, voice even, not apologetic. It struck him then that she was not thanking him for the marriage. He stepped aside, and she entered without ceremony, carrying her own bag, her own weight. They learned each other the way one learns a landscape in winter, slowly, by contrast. Eliza spoke little, but she did not shrink. She took the room in with a calm that suggested she had already survived worse than awkward silence. Silas showed her where things were kept, pointing more than explaining. That night, they ate without much conversation, the sound of spoons against tin loud in the quiet. When she asked where she should sleep, he gestured toward the small room he had prepared. She paused only a second, then nodded, as if accepting a fact of weather. In town, the marriage had already begun without them. Words traveled faster than people, and by the time they made their first trip down together, the story had settled into something solid enough to bruise. They walked a careful distance apart, not out of intention but habit, as though proximity required permission. Ezekiel Boone watched them from a storefront, eyes sharp with interest, and said something low to his wife that made her frown. Eliza heard it. Silas saw her shoulders stiffen, saw her choose not to react. He did nothing, and the doing of nothing felt heavier than the sacks of flour he carried back up the mountain. Winter tightened its hold. Days shortened. The world narrowed to what could be touched and heated and endured. They worked around each other at first, then with each other, learning the unspoken rhythms of shared space. Eliza mended a tear in his coat without asking. Silas fixed the latch on her trunk that had been sticking. These were small acts, but they carried weight, the kind that settled into the bones. Sometimes she read by the fire in the evenings, her voice soft but steady, and Silas listened from the edge of the room, not following the story so much as the sound of her breathing. It reminded him, unexpectedly, of his mother, long gone, who had once read aloud to keep the dark from getting ideas. One afternoon, while the wind worried the walls, Eliza found a broken clock tucked into a drawer. She turned it over in her hands, tracing the crack in its face. "It can be fixed," she said, not asking if she should. Silas watched as she worked, patient, precise, and when the clock ticked again, something in his chest answered it. He had not realized how long the silence of that thing had lived with him. The town did not soften right away. If anything, the cold sharpened it. Words were fewer, looks longer. Eliza bore it with a dignity that surprised him. She did not complain, did not ask him to intervene. That restraint, that quiet endurance, unsettled Silas more than anger would have. He had built his life around not needing much, and here was a woman who needed even less, yet gave more than expected. A blizzard came one night without warning, the kind that erased edges and made the world feel newly made and hostile. The wind pressed against the cabin like a question it would not stop asking. Inside, the fire burned high. Eliza sat close enough that Silas could feel the heat of her through the space they did not cross. She read until her voice tired, then set the book aside. For a long moment, neither spoke. The storm filled the silence, loud enough to stand in for all the things they had not said. Silas realized then that he was no longer counting the days. The marriage he had prepared to endure was no longer something he merely survived. He did not name the change. Naming things made them fragile. Instead, he fed the fire, listened to the wind, and let the quiet between them hold. When Eliza finally rose and wished him good night, there was something steadier in her eyes, and something looser in his chest. The mountain remained cold and unyielding, but inside the cabin, a different season had begun to make itself known, subtle as the first promise of thaw beneath deep snow. Morning returned in fragments after the storm, light spilling through the frost-lined window, as if the sun itself were unsure it was welcome. The mountain stood rinsed and quiet, every sound muted by fresh snow. Silas woke before Eliza, as he usually did, but this time he lingered by the fire instead of stepping outside. He watched her sleep from a respectful distance, the steady rise of her breath easing something restless in him. It struck him then that peace was not the absence of noise, but the presence of someone who did not ask you to be more than you were. Eliza moved through the days differently after that night. Not warmer, exactly, but more certain. She hummed while she worked, soft and tuneless, a sound that settled into the cabin like a second heartbeat. Silas found himself timing his movements to it, chopping wood when she paused, pouring coffee when her song drifted low. They spoke a little more, though never about the things that hovered closest. Words were still precious, used sparingly, but the silence between them no longer felt like a test. When they went down to town again, they walked closer, not arm in arm, not deliberately, but near enough that their coats brushed when the wind pressed in. The looks came as expected. Ezekiel Boone's eyes followed them, sharp with unfinished opinions. A remark slipped loose near the counter, careless and cruel, something about charity and mistakes made back east. Eliza stiffened, the smallest tightening of her jaw, and Silas felt it like a blow meant for him. This time, he did not let the moment pass. He did not raise his voice or offer a speech. He simply stepped to her side and placed his hand on the counter between them and the world, steady and unmovable. The room noticed. Clara Boone met Eliza's gaze and, after a breath, nodded, a small mercy, but a real one. On the mountain, winter began to show its deeper teeth. Snow piled high enough to seal the road, and supplies grew thin. Silas rationed without saying so. Eliza noticed anyway. One night, she placed her portion back into the pot when she thought he wasn't looking. He saw, of course. The gesture lodged itself somewhere tender. He wanted to tell her to eat, to insist, but instead he ladled the food back into her bowl and added a bit more. Their eyes met over the steam, and for the first time, the quiet carried something like gratitude openly shared. The storm that followed was worse than the first, a long, grinding thing that shook the cabin and tested every joint and nail. The fire faltered. The roof groaned under the weight of ice. They worked together without instruction, hands passing tools, bodies moving in a practiced rhythm that felt older than either of them. When the wind tore a shutter loose, Eliza held the ladder steady while Silas climbed, her hands firm despite the cold biting through her gloves. In that moment, balanced between sky and ground, he understood how deeply she trusted him. The knowledge settled with the seriousness of a vow. That night, as the storm reached its loudest pitch, Eliza stood by the door with her coat on. She said she should go when the road cleared, said it calmly, as if stating a fact that had always been true. The town would never soften completely. His life would always be this hard. She would not be the reason he bore extra weight. Silas listened, the firelight cutting her face into planes of resolve and fear. He did not argue. He went to the small box beneath his bed and took out his mother's ring, worn thin by time and work. He placed it in Eliza's palm and closed her fingers over it. "This is an obligation," he said, his voice rough with use and disuse alike. "It's choice." Eliza did not cry. She opened her hand and studied the ring, then slipped it onto her finger without ceremony. The storm did not stop, but something in the room did. The fear eased. The air warmed. When the wind finally exhausted itself and dawn arrived pale and tentative, they stood together at the window, shoulder to shoulder, watching the mountain breathe again. Spring did not come quickly, but it came honestly. Snow receded in patient patches. The road reopened. Town visits grew easier. Gossip lost its edge when it found nothing to cut. Eliza began teaching children from the neighboring ranches, her voice carrying laughter now and then. Silas watched her from the fence line, a quiet pride taking root where shame once lived. The marriage was never announced as a triumph. It simply became true. Years later, when the mountain had softened their faces and lined their hands, Silas would think back to that winter and understand what it had given him. Love had not arrived like a rescue. It had arrived like work shared, like warmth earned, like silence that no longer hurt. He would remember how dignity grows slowly, how self-worth is built from the smallest, bravest choices made when no one is watching. And if you are listening to this with something heavy in your chest, standing at the edge of your own long winter, know this. Not every beginning feels like hope. Some feel like endurance. But if you stay, if you choose kindness over fear and patience over pride, you may find that what you were preparing to survive becomes the place you finally belong. If this story warmed something quiet inside you, stay with us. Subscribe for more Wild West tales, where hearts learn, slowly and honestly, how to outlast the cold.